Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. This is podcast 6. In this podcast, we will be discussing the book Expecting Adam by Martha Beck. You can use the link on our website at modernathenas.com to order the book after the podcast. We chose to talk about this book on our podcast because it addresses many of the challenges and issues that we all face as we navigate through our lives. The challenge of feeling that we belong, that we are good enough, that we are making the right choices for ourselves and for our families. We all struggle with pain and fear, with loss and sadness. And as we struggle to make our way in the world, we often wonder if we are making the right decisions, if we are doing the right thing. Expecting Adam is the journey of Martha Beck and the pregnancy and birth of her son Adam, who has Down syndrome. The book opens with Martha taking the reader back to the start of her pregnancy when she was a PhD student at Harvard. The story then winds its way through the triumphs and travails of her pregnancy, including when she received the news of Adam's condition, and concludes with Adam's birth. Throughout the book, Martha weaves in stories about Adam as he grows up, painting an intimate portrait of her son and the way he sees the world. Martha also brings to light the issues of family, hope, destiny, and expectations. There are some issues in the book that we will not be addressing today, including religion, abortion, and genetic engineering. But we, as always, invite our readers to read Expecting Adam and listen to Martha's compelling story and her discussion of these issues. We also want to mention that although Martha makes use of the word retarded in the book, we do not feel as though the word is the best word to describe Adam or other children with Down syndrome. As a result, unless we are directly quoting from the book, we will be using the term special needs. We begin Martha's story at Harvard, where she and her husband John both received their bachelor's degrees and are now both pursuing their PhDs. Martha paints a picture of her time at Harvard that many of our listeners will recognize. Quote, "To me, being a student there was heady, exciting, even thrilling, but these sensations came laced with heavy doses of fear and misery. It was like having lunch with a brilliant, learned, witty celebrity who liked to lean across the table at unpredictable intervals and slap me in the mouth. Hard. Was it interesting? Very. Stimulating? In more ways than one. Pleasant? I don't think so. To say that hiding my fears did not come naturally to me is to make a profound understatement. I had a tendency to babble hysterically and blink a lot whenever I dealt with Harvard. At least I learned to fake self-confidence, probably as well as the next graduate student. I was very deliberate about this. Before I went on campus for any reason, I would consciously call up a portion of my personality I call Fang. I would focus very hard on being Fang until I could squash down every thought or feeling that wasn't part of her. Fang fit in beautifully at Harvard. She was fearless, aggressive, sardonic, voraciously competitive. She never ate entire pound bags of M&Ms or sat with her feet in the bathroom sink crying the way I was wont to after a hard day's lunch with the slapping celebrity. I had relied on Fang since my freshman year, and she had served me well." End quote. I think a lot of us struggle when we're in situations with other very intelligent people or where we're feeling like we are maybe not the smartest person in the room, and we end up struggling with this sort of notion of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I was in music school for 6 years of college, which is pretty competitive because you're at the top of your game and so is the other 800 people there. And I remember in college trying to portray that I was practicing enough, or if it didn't seem that I was still satisfied with the level of practice that I was doing, as if I was kind of actually calculating the amount of breaks that I would take, when in fact I was constantly feeling like I was underachieving. And at the same time, I would get into these bouts of being unmotivated. So I don't know, I feel like college is kind of a weird mix of intensity, and then you're justifying how much you're doing or you're not doing, mixed with this achievement and pressure to really look like you're at the top of your game and kind of unflappable and overachieving. And I accomplished a lot, but I often wonder if I had prioritized differently or had been more disciplined, what more would I have accomplished? But I always felt like I was maintaining this air of I was in control of the situation.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I graduated from high school in probably the top 1% of my class. And I got to Smith and it was a totally different universe. I was surrounded by these brilliant women. And for the first time, I felt completely inadequate. I remember walking into my first chemistry class, and there were only 8 of us in this class. It was basically taking a year of inorganic chemistry in one semester. So it was sort of this accelerated class, and I had been let into the class because I had taken AP chemistry and I had gotten a very high score on the AP test and I had done well in the class. So the professor was like, "Sure, come and join us." And I remember sitting in there the first lecture, and I absolutely had no idea what was going on. And I felt that way almost through the entire semester. I just felt like I didn't belong there. Like I had no reason to be in that class. It was moving at a frenetic pace. And eventually, the class ended. I did fine in the class, but I had that feeling for probably the first 2 years of college. And I took this other class in biochemistry because I turned out to be a biochemistry major. And actually taking the first biochemistry class really sort of settled me down. And it was the first time that things started clicking in a class. And then I found a Middle Eastern government class, and that started clicking. And I started realizing the more I interacted with other smithies and the more that I was in some of these classes, that I did belong there, and everybody else felt the same way I did. And that, I wasn't alone, and people were very intimidated by the intelligence that was in the room.
Well, and it seemed like you could see either side of the coin, whether people were honest with each other about the struggles or putting on an air of, I've got this in control and I'm doing awesome. And you could see either side of that coin at any moment. It was never this smooth transition from one to the other, because you're living in this intense environment where you're also in a dorm, and so you're always around these people. At least I was in a dorm, but it was kind of a roller coaster.
Yeah, and Smith has a very unique housing system. So the vast majority of undergraduates live on campus all 4 years, and we live in houses. There's no sororities, but in essence, your house becomes your sorority. Some people move between houses, but most of the time you end up staying in the house that either you're in your first year or you move to your sophomore year. And there's a lot of this house loyalty, and there's some fervor between different competitive houses, but that part of it's a lot of fun. But when you live in this house, in my instance with 80 women, you get to really know everybody over the course of the years because you all live together continuously. You eat together, you hang out together, down in the living room, you watch TV together, you hang out in the hallways, you hang out in each other's rooms. And, initially when I got there, I was so intimidated by all of these amazing women and everything that they were doing. And then over time, you start to realize that they're normal. And so I want to go back to the book and listen to when Martha finally realized that. And sometimes when we experience imposter syndrome, we later realize that there was no reason to feel like an imposter. Martha describes her experience when she first realized that she belonged at Harvard. Quote, "I was giddy with exhilaration because after 7 years at Harvard, I was just beginning to realize that I wasn't the only one faking it. And thus I learned at Harvard, while knowing a great deal is the norm and knowing everything is the goal, appearing to know everything is considered an acceptable substitute." End quote. And I mean, I've definitely experienced the same thing, and not just at college, but in grad school and law school. It's this appearance that people put on, and sometimes even I myself put on, of knowing everything. And I feel like it actually breeds more confidence in myself. And that if I can sort of portray that confidence, I actually start feeling it.
Well, and I felt like it wasn't until I was beyond college and started my first career, and then I got married, and then I started kind of seeing other people as normal people with their own lives. I don't know, before then it was all about the studying or the practicing or the work, and my eyes began to open as to how other people struggled each day or lived life to its fullest, especially once I had a kid, because then all these other conversations open about other areas of your life. I felt like I was very compartmentalized up until that point. And maybe it was because I wasn't a very social person outside of my job. I kind of went to work and I had friends at work, but I didn't really hang out with them outside of work. And maybe that would have changed it or accelerated the timeline. So I thought of them as normal people sooner. But did you, in your work, socialize outside of work with your coworkers?
Well, it's interesting because I don't do a whole lot of socializing outside of work. I tend to cling to friends that I've had for a long time. And a lot of those are actually good friends that I met in college, whether that was at Smith or when I did ROTC. But those are some of my best friends through till today. And it's interesting because we can pick up conversation that we, and in the middle of nothing, and just feel like we have been talking for, days and days. And, I really felt for a very, very long time of this sort of imposter syndrome. No matter what sort of career field I was going into, I always felt like I didn't belong and that there were other people that were smarter than me and better than me and faster than me and just, had more knowledge. And I really remember law school, my first year, because took a course called contracts, and everybody takes contracts in what's called your 1L or your first year of law school. And I remember sitting in the room, and there were these two gentlemen that were in my class, and they just seemed to know every single answer all the time. I mean, there was never anything that they didn't know. And finally, I realized, I've been to Smith, I could learn the same thing. And what I didn't know until about 2-3 months in is they used this sort of cheat book on the side that taught them all these concepts before we got to class.
Wow.
And so it was kind of funny because I realized they're not any smarter than I am. And, it gave me a little bit of confidence. But, these friends that I've had and held on to are all friends that really have respected me and I've respected them and their abilities. And yeah, I'm definitely in awe of what a lot of my friends have accomplished. I have, I'm thinking right now of these 3 women that I went through ROTC with who have all become just amazing women. 2 of them are still in the military and one is out now, but they've just done incredible things with their lives. One of them had a congressional fellowship, and one of them is now currently a very big time public affairs officer in the Pacific Theater. And it's just, they've done these incredible things. And so sometimes I feel like, wow, I haven't done anything incredible in my life that, matches what they've done.
Well, there's a singer-songwriter, Amanda Palmer, who's also written a book called The Art of Asking, but she has this term that I actually really like called the fraud police. And she always talks about how she's afraid the fraud police is going to show up at her door and say, well, we figured you out. You're not really who you say you are, and you're not really qualified to be doing, claiming what you can do. But, she uses that as a metaphor for just kind of that anxiety that someone's going to find out that we aren't really as smart as we're portraying or something. But what it boils down to is, like you said, just kind of finding those things that we are confident and passionate about. And I think when we speak to what we know, we don't have to pretend. The excellence and the strength will shine through naturally.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of my life thinking that the fraud police are going to show up. I think a lot of us do, because no matter how much we know, as women, I think we tend to underestimate ourselves. And I don't generally see the same thing in men, particularly, for instance, in the legal field. I remember going to my first court hearing. I was completely petrified. I think I've mentioned this before, but the counsel on the other side was a man who was about 40, 45, clearly had done, 500 hearings before, just extremely confident. And when it was my turn to talk, he kept interrupting me. And I thought, oh boy, the judge is going to figure out that I don't have any idea what I'm talking about. And he's going to just say, counsel, why didn't you bring the partner with you? And he's just going to figure me out. And actually what the judge did is he actually told the opposing counsel to hang on because it wasn't his turn to speak. And then he looked me right in the eye and said, I want to hear what you have to say. And just hearing that sort of vote of confidence that I could do it was huge. And I have found that throughout my career, that when you can find that mentor or that person, whether it be a man or a woman, that really listens to you and sort of almost validates your strength and validates your ability to do things, I think is huge. So Martha introduces us to her friend Sibyl when Sibyl shows up unexpectedly at Martha's house with groceries while her husband John was away for work in Asia. Martha was pregnant with Adam and already suffering from severe nausea and morning sickness while trying to still take care of her toddler daughter, Katie. Martha was embarrassed for Sibyl to see how sick and disordered she was, but what was most shocking was that Sibyl just happened to stop by at the very moment that Martha needed her the most. Quote, Sibyl stayed with me for over an hour, playing with Katie, bathing her and changing her diapers, while I gradually relaxed enough to sip some raspberry juice. She did all of this in a pragmatic, unsentimental way, as though she had been planning it for weeks, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Sibyl's matter-of-fact demeanor was the only thing that kept me from being utterly overwhelmed by her kindness, end quote. Eventually, Sibyl brought Deirdre, another friend, with her to visit Martha. Quote, neither Sibyl nor Deirdre showed a trace of the snobbery I have often seen in beautiful women, nor was there any of the professional puffiness that has grown so familiar to me, end quote. I think it was really important for Martha to have friends. And, like you were just mentioning, Sonia, she didn't seem to have a whole lot of friends outside of her sort of PhD program. She had her husband, John, but she kind of learned never to rely on anybody. And we'll talk later about, asking for help. But really seemed like Sibyl showed up just at the right time.
I felt like Sibyl and Deirdre and even John, her husband at times, when Martha was kind of on this like storm and turbulent water of like a storm almost, it's like they kept pulling her back into shore with these really simple actions. And it was so heartwarming to see how Sibyl and Deirdre's gracious love for Martha just kind of almost calmed her down, and with these simple actions of bringing her food or just sitting with her. And in a way, it made me think about what are the actions that I can do. Sometimes you feel like you don't know what to do if someone's in pain or discouraged. And sometimes it's just a simple thing of like sitting with them at a table or listening. And I think sometimes women feel like they have to fix everything. I know I do. I want to like, okay, let's get through this problem and like get to the other side. But sometimes you need to just sit there with the person as they're kind of going through this storm and just be there as a calming presence for them.
Yeah, and I think so often, like you were saying, we all want to do something. And we just don't know what to say or what to do or how to comfort friends. And I think we often make too much of an effort to do something rather than just sitting or just asking them what they could use. Or, for instance, Sibyl bringing groceries by. It was such a small gesture, but it was so meaningful to Martha. And I think if we could look at our friendships with people and really look at those small things, go back to college for a minute, and I was having sort of what I would call a midlife crisis, but at this sort of moment in college. And one of my friends came over. She was actually going to a different school than I went to. We had met in ROTC. We didn't see each other that often, but she brought me over a stuffed monkey late at night. And it was the littlest gesture, but the stuffed monkey meant so much to me at that moment. I didn't feel so alone. I felt that someone cared about me and about what was going on. And I actually still have that monkey. It always symbolizes to me it's the little things in life that can make a big difference in other people's lives.
Well, and I have my very best girlfriend, Sheila. She and I actually met when we were 13. And she's an oboist like I am, and we went to undergrad and grad school together.
That's incredible.
She was the maid of honor in my wedding. I went to her wedding. I have a son now. She has a son. And, so we've known each other for over 20 years. And it's really incredible because she and I speak probably once every other month now, but we've been through so much together that even a 10-minute conversation with each other, it's kind of like we're back in that place, even though she lives in Spokane, Washington, and I'm here in Nashville. But, it's just, that's such a heartwarming connection that it's very encouraging to just know that that's there. And it's kind of supplemented by maybe these people who are immediately in my life and that I do see every day. And I think if we kind of build this almost like layered network of people around us that can kind of offer these different things, and we can be open to being that any level of that role for someone else. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as you and I have both mentioned, we have that sort of inner circle of friends that have been around forever, and we can always pick up with them at any time. And I think that those are the people in your life that you really have to hold on to, and you've got to make an effort to hold on to them. Let them know that they're cherished. Send them a card. I know that sounds so old fashioned to most people, but you're probably friends with them on social media, and so who's going to send a card or anything but a text? But it really shows that you care and you're thinking about them, and doing those sort of small acts of kindness when the going is good and it's not rough, or you don't need them, you're just sort of expressing your friendship. Those really make a difference to people. And then in those moments of need, you can still call on each other. And I still also think that besides your inner circle, you have that sort of acquaintance level of friends, which maybe you met them through your children or, play dates, or maybe you met them at work, or maybe you met them through a hobby, but you can still include them in your circle, and just keeping a mindful eye on people and thinking about those small acts of kindness that you can even do for your acquaintances that, they wouldn't expect, but that can be very meaningful to them. So we want to talk a bit about coping with unexpected life changes, because Martha had not planned for her pregnancy. Quote, "Mind you, this was insane. I didn't have time to be pregnant. I was well aware of this because I, or at least Fang, was the kind of person who made elaborate and detailed plans for my life several years in advance. I am not exaggerating here. You could always tell where I'd been by following the trail of paper scraps with time grids and to-do lists scribbled on them. I was the unofficial mascot of the Franklin Day Planner people, my schedule fixed in 15-minute intervals for years to come. That September was the worst possible time for me to exercise my fertility option. I was taking a full load of classes, teaching sections for a course in Caribbean society, and planning to be Katie's single parent while John was away in Asia. The very last thing I could afford to do was bear live young again. For one thing, during my first go-round, pregnancy had made me feel only slightly better than the Ebola virus would have. For another thing, I had to guard my reputation as a scholar." End quote. So Martha clearly was very anxious about having this pregnancy, but I think that often for a lot of us, big life changes or life events come when we're expecting them the very least.
The to-do list and the timelines and the grids, that's totally me. Like, that's my life of how I like to stay organized. But I also feel like I'm a really adaptive and creative problem solver. But there was a particularly large curveball that was thrown my way a while ago. It was actually a few years after Jordan and I got married that I didn't know how to handle. And essentially, we wanted to start a family, and I thought that would be really simple because everybody talks about you get married, you buy a house, you start a family. And, instead, it took 4 years and 4 miscarriages before the miracle of Ethan. And I have to admit, during that time, I was devastated and resentful because I had no control over it. There was no way I could change the circumstances, and I didn't understand why it was happening. And, so I tried my best to accept that I didn't have control, but it was a really hard time. But on the flip side, now I have much more appreciation for having a family than had it come easily for me.
Yeah, I actually laughed when I was reading this, because for people that know me, for listeners that kind of listen to this podcast and they know me from life, they would definitely consider me a Franklin Day Planner person. I am a planner through and through. And in college, I had this one responsibility for our ROTC unit for a while of being the planner. I mean, that was literally my responsibility. I had to plan training and plan where people were going. And I had Excel spreadsheet after Excel spreadsheet with just where everybody's going to be at the exact right moment. And then when we got out there, it rained. And that kind of threw all the plans into just absolute chaos. And I think for the first time in my life, I realized how little I have control over the universe and things that are going to happen. And throughout my adult life, over and over again, I've had just these unexpected life events, and they've really made me over time start to realize that you have to cherish the moment that you're living in. And while it's great to have a 5-year and 10-year plan and maybe a 15-year financial plan, you also have to realize that life is going to intervene and it's not going to go the way that you think it's going to go. And I think being open to that and just realizing that, and that when those events kind of come, you can roll with the event a little bit, and it won't destroy your entire universe because you're sort of in essence prepared for it to come.
I really liked how Martha Beck wrote this book, and it's such an honest language, and she's got a sense of humor and she's a bit sarcastic at times, but I feel like she took us through those emotions, even, you know, and the whole book is about that kind of something unexpected happens and how you respond to it. But she was angry and upset and devastated and crying and laughing at one point. But I really appreciated that because it didn't invalidate all those emotions we do feel in those instances. It actually kind of validated them and gave a voice to them. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and I think it was great that she was so real about what was happening to her because, you know, pregnancy is supposed to be this thing that everybody's so excited about. It's kind of like you're starting your first career. You're supposed to be so excited about it. Getting your PhD, you're supposed to be so excited. But that's not what most people feel. Everybody feels this trepidation, this fear, this, you know, this unknown that's kind of creeping up on them. And nobody talks about those things because it's just, quote, not normal. But I think if people started to open up, they'd realize everybody goes through those emotions, you know, whether it be you're buying a new house and you're terrified about the mortgage payment and ensuring that you continue to be able to have a job to pay your mortgage payment, or, you know, you get pregnant, you start to have kids, or people that get a puppy and have no idea what they're doing. You know, or you're moving to a new city for your job and you've got absolutely no clue where to live or, you know, how you're going to get to work every day because you have no idea what city you're living in. And just listening to her in the book speak about all of these different variables that she was struggling with was really heartwarming because she was so very honest. And one of the things that she talked about was getting Katie into daycare. And I know a lot of our listeners who have children, daycare is a big hurdle. It's expensive and you got to find a spot for your kid. In this day and age, it's very competitive in some places. And so she kind of tells a story about getting Katie into this daycare close to Harvard. And it has this quota system and it seemed like some complex algorithm as to which children they took. But just listening to her tell that, I could tell that, you know, she was very anxious about it and it made her fearful about, you know, what would happen if it didn't work out. But yet she has this inner strength that it always does work out. And she falls back on that, whether it's consciously or not. And it kind of guides her through those moments. We all struggle with balancing work and life, and Martha was no different. As we discussed earlier, she was a PhD candidate at Harvard when she became pregnant with Adam. Quote, "Back then, even the potential for motherhood was most definitely a blot on the credibility of female students and staff. I had several friends who obtained abortions when accidental pregnancies threatened to scuttle their academic progress. It often seemed to me that success at Harvard depended on being willing to put personal reasons so low on one's priority list that they dropped right off the bottom." End quote. And I don't think Martha is alone in the feelings that she felt about having a pregnancy and even having a marriage during, you know, while she's getting her PhD. There just seems to be this expectation in academia, or at least that I've experienced in academia, that, as Martha says, you have to stick everything else aside and focus on academics. And I just think that's so unrealistic. And I've seen it again in various career fields where people just forget that everybody has a personal life.
This component of the book I actually had found rather absurd. Even, you know, there's interactions between John, her husband, and his professors, and just this total disregard for the importance of like home life. Because I guess I'm really thankful that working in the arts, I feel like it's a really family-friendly, family-supportive environment that I was the one that needed to draw boundaries in a sense. Like the environments I've worked in at an orchestra, I could put in lots of hours, but when I had a kid, I was able to put parameters around my own work, still get the work done, and people were very supportive. So I'm just thankful for that after especially reading all of these experiences and how intense some other industries probably are about this. I'm glad I haven't really had to deal with that.
I would definitely say, Sonia, you're probably in the minority because there's a lot of industries, particularly ones that are historically male dominated, where for some reason women's personal lives aren't accepted in the workplace. But if guys want to go, for instance, to coach their son's t-ball team or the soccer team, or they want to go see their kid wrestle, that's totally okay. But for a woman to do that, it's sort of frowned upon. And it's this weird double standard that definitely, I think, still exists in some industries. It's getting better. And as people are starting to, take paternity leave as well as maternity leave, and those sort of equalizations in the home are starting. I think that the tide is changing, but it's, I think, a very slow turn.
Yeah, again, this just opens my eyes to the reality that environment, it probably exists pretty strongly. And I don't know what to say other than I feel like drawing your own boundaries and letting your work speak for yourself so that people can't question. And what else can they question? Like, if your work is getting done and it's being done well, like the parameters around your job. Otherwise, it would. I don't know. It would seem like they can't really speak to how long you're there if your work is getting done and it's excellent.
Yeah, but I think that sometimes if people have lived a certain life, for instance, an older white male that's lived in a very traditional marriage, or what we would consider to be a traditional marriage, I think that that individual sees the world through a different lens. And so it's not about the work of a woman and how good the work is. He's looking at her and thinking, is she going to be going out on maternity leave and leaving me in the lurch for months? Is she going to go get married and run off? Is she going to want to take all this time for childcare? I think that those thoughts are still very pervasive in people who grew up or who have lived through a different time period than we're living today. And I think that men in today, or younger men, don't have this necessarily the same perception or that same lens that older men still have. So Martha discusses her severe nausea that was so debilitating that it was hard for her to care for Katie. When John was away in Asia, it was even worse. One weekend when John was away, Martha grew steadily weaker and sicker. By evening, she was unable to eat and finally began to panic. Yet she says, quote, "It never occurred to me to call anyone for help," end quote. And I was really taken by the way that Martha resisted reaching out to people. And even after Sibyl came over that day with groceries and Deirdre came over, she still resisted asking. And I think that a lot of us struggle frequently to ask for help.
I definitely related to this because I think women are expected to. I was thinking about this. Men are expected to be strong, and women are too. But women are, I think, expected in a way to bear others' burdens, and so if you have your own, I almost, in those cases, like I've felt, well, what are people even going to care to know about this thing that I'm worried about or that I'm anxious about? They've got the problems of their own. Why would I burden them with mine? And also putting on this air that I'm strong, I've gotten in control. So there's kind of this strange juxtaposition of these two. But I think when we do that, we're actually kind of putting up these walls around us. And no wonder we feel isolated. I know I've felt isolated in those moments, but it's kind of self-imposed.
Yeah, and I believe that all those things are true, but I've also learned that friends want you to reach out, and they like it when you reach out because they feel trusted and they feel that friendship with you. And I feel the same way when friends reach out to me and ask for help, or they are struggling through something and they want to talk about it. And that makes me feel like they value the friendship. So I try and think about that and think about that sharing is not weak, and that we're not giving up any control when we share our situations. We're actually making it better for ourselves because we're able to sort of lower that anxiety, and we're also maybe even going to be able to get a perspective that we hadn't thought about yet.
Well, and I wonder if maybe when I'm feeling those thoughts, giving people the benefit of the doubt that they want, if I give them the choice on whether or not to help me out, they'd make the right choice and they'd extend the hand and be there or whatever. But sometimes I think it's easy to create your own assumptions about how people are going to react. And I definitely err on the side of doing that way too much.
Yeah. So now we want to talk a little bit about Martha's decision to keep Adam after finding out that he was going to have Down syndrome, and sort of a little bit about her mothering and her parenting. So after finding out he had Down syndrome, Martha never contemplated not keeping Adam. But that did not stop others, including doctors, Harvard colleagues, and friends, from offering their opinions about Martha's decision. Quote, "If I were to go on like this, to speak back to everyone whose personal philosophy rode Adam's coattails into my life, this book would be way too long. Believe me, it was hard to listen to all the verbiage generated by people who heard about Adam's disability and my choice. I never thought of the right thing to say back to any of them until long after they had gone away. I did, at long last, realize that it didn't really matter what anyone else's opinion of my decision might be. What mattered was that I had made a choice that felt as though, in the end, it would bring me to the place I needed to go. I took a long breath. Everything I had ever striven for, every hope I'd ever hoped and dream I'd ever dreamt, seemed to be poised like a delicate Fabergé egg between the tips of my fingers. No, I whispered. Then the egg fell, smashing into a million shards on the floor. End quote. I was really thinking, as Martha is talking about this, how many different life decisions I've made that others critique, and they have no idea about all the variables that have gone into the decision.
I totally agree. It's exactly where my head was, is some critical life decisions. As you enter the professional world and really adulthood, and whether it's what church to go to or not to go to, what lifestyle to live, how to raise Ethan. And I think in the beginning of when I was trying to establish these opinions and critical decisions, I would really dig my heels in proclaiming them to my family and friends. And then if they disapproved, it was just this friction. And now I feel like I would rather silently consider what others might think and maybe hear them out, but I still make the best and right decision for me and my family, but maybe more sensitively deliver a message. And I think it also has required me to open my ears up and listen a lot more than I used to.
Yeah, I always find it interesting when others critique my life decisions because they have no idea what's gone into my decision. And, like you're saying, it's good to listen to other people, but when you're making a critical decision for yourself, you got to listen to your inner self. And you got to shut out the noise. And I think that that's one of the things Martha was talking about in the book about, hearing everybody else's opinions so much that it started to just be overwhelming. And she had made the decision that was best for her. And I often think that, I can be a better supporter of my friends and their decisions and not look so critically at things that people are doing, because I can certainly always find something to critique. That's pretty easy. But I don't live their life. I don't know the struggles that they've gone through. And quite frankly, very rarely do you know all the reasons why they've made the decision that they've made.
Well, and even the doctors she talked about were not in favor of her decision to keep Adam. And I likened that to how people sometimes critique what they don't understand and also what looks different to them. And so that really reminded myself, like, if someone's making a decision that I don't understand or doesn't look like my decisions, that's okay. And we should actually support people in those different decisions. And when I think people really do critique harshly, like the decisions that they think people should be making so that they look more like them, I think that in the end, those doctors didn't feel comfortable with Martha's decision. And so she shouldn't feel comfortable with it either.
Yeah. And I was thinking when I was reading that about this idea as you were, that we don't always have a basis from which to really understand other people's decisions. And I think it's just being aware of that. And again, it goes to that we don't walk a day in their shoes, or, we don't walk in their shoes in life. And so it's knowing your own biases and knowing the sort of tilt that you look through the world at, and just being sensitive to that when you're sort of judging other people. One of the main themes in the book is this idea of mothers and mothering. Martha provides some interesting thoughts on the topic. Quote, "This is my first tentative, wary encounter with one of the greatest gifts I would receive from Adam. The understanding that the word mother is more powerful when it is used as a verb than as a noun. The good news is that, while mothers are often in short supply, mothering is not. Against all odds, despite everything that works against it on this unpleasant, uncomfortable planet, mothering is here in abundance. You can always find it if you're smart and you know where to look." End quote. And that made me really start to think about all the people that I've encountered in my life who have those mother qualities but aren't my mom.
Well, and also it made me think about those family qualities too. I read somewhere, I don't know, several years ago, something about how to treat every woman as if they're your sister or niece or mother or aunt or grandmother, based on kind of generational age and things. And it really spoke to me, because it opened my eyes as to how to see them more as a person. And I've definitely had mentors, blood related or not, that have given me little jewels of knowledge along the way. And so I really try to see the person before me for who they are. And it really brings an intimacy to those conversations, I think, when I can think of them as almost like this close relative.
Yeah, and I read somewhere a long time ago that, you have your blood family, but then you have your life family. And those are the people that you've surrounded yourselves with and created this, as you're saying, this close relative or family network. And those people can sometimes be just as close as your blood family because they're there and they're supportive and you spend time and investment in those relationships. When we experience life changes, we ourselves change. For parents, the arrival of a child is a life-altering moment, a moment that separates the before from the after. For others experiencing moments of pain or loss, they too experience the before and after. But rather than looking at transforming the event or the child to fit within her life plan, Martha looked within and transformed herself. Quote, slowly, standing in the co-op, I realized that I was not looking for information to transform my child into a prize every parent would envy. I needed to transform myself into a parent who could accept her child no matter what. There were no books for that in the parenting section of the Harvard co-op. Later on, she said, quote, this little boy may not look like what you asked for, the man may have told me. He may not have the features you requested or be able to perform all the tricks. But put him in place and he will light up your life. You have no idea how much magic is in him. End quote. And reading about Martha's acceptance that Adam was going to be different made me really think about different ways that I could change myself or change my perspective to accept things that I can't change.
My thoughts went to kind of a recent knowledge of how to identify when it's your ego speaking, are you frustrated? Do you feel like you're being wronged? Well, might actually be your ego. And like, it's almost like the more you can identify that and kind of take on humility of, yes, I'm the one that actually needs to change, then I think you can open your eyes to more, see better what's around you and give more fully without the expectation of receiving anything back. And I just loved the how Martha spoke about Adam throughout this book and how he changed her, but she really had to be willing to change.
Yeah, and now let's talk about a little bit about the little things in life and how Adam's perspective on the world changed Martha's perspective. We are often so focused on the things in front of our eyes, on the priorities we have to get done and errands we have to run, things we have to do to survive our day-to-day lives. But in doing so, we forget to slow down, to take in the little things, and to focus on what is truly important. As Martha says, quote, real magic doesn't come from achieving the perfect appearance, from being Cinderella at the ball with both glass slippers and a killer hairstyle. The real magic is in the pumpkin, in the mice, in the moonlight, not beyond ordinary life, but within it. It is amazing to live with someone who genuinely couldn't care less about getting ahead, someone who is absolutely committed to finding joy in the present moment. Adam's birth convinced us that fate was quite capable of crushing our best laid plans like so many dead beetles. In the face of such uncertainty, the only things that seemed to us worth doing are the ones that allow us to experience the strange and eventful journey of life in its full richness. After spending the first decades of my own life in a desperate attempt to pass every arbitrary test placed before me by the educational system and the rest of society, I have to be constantly reminded that the end goal of all of this striving is to live joyfully, and that there are often more direct ways of achieving this than conforming to rigid standards set by social custom. End quotes. And listening to Martha talk about this and talking about how Adam really made her change and made her start to look at those little things and sort of get off the rat race and get out of the rat race a little bit of you got to do the next thing, you got to write the next paper, you got to get the next degree, really made me wonder in my own life about the times that I've sort of gotten out of the rat race, those moments of reflection or pause, and been able to step away or detach from the situation and realize that it's the little things that actually make all the difference.
It really seemed like Adam kind of was able to help Martha remove these blinders from her view and just, she saw more of the world more fully. And I'd have to kind of relate to Martha in this passage because I really felt a healing when I finally did have Ethan. And more recently, I've gained much more awareness of my safe and comfortable life here in America. And, through all of that, I see the small wonders in each day, whether it's hearing music or feeling the warm sunshine, connecting with a family member, making a new friend, or even the opportunity to help someone. And I'm very, very thankful for this because I feel much more grounded and as if life has slowed down a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's taking those moments to just cherish the moment that you're in. And sometimes I'm very aware that the moment is happening, and other times I look back on it and I really think, wow, that was a really cool moment. Like my niece and nephew were just up here last week visiting, and both of them wanted to cuddle with me. And just sitting there with my nephew one night, just listening to him talk about absolutely nothing important. It was this game he's playing on his iPad, but just having that time with him is really precious. And, I think the same way about when I can have a cup of coffee with my mom in the morning and just having that 10 minutes to talk and catch up with each other. And those are sort of the moments that we'll remember. And, there's always that old adage of you can't take money and belongings with you when you die, but you'll always have your memories. And so I think it's really important to slow down and to have those moments. Beyond imposter syndrome, which we discussed earlier in this podcast, many of us struggle to feel as though we're good enough in life. One night, Martha and John were trying to bake cookies, an activity that they often did together at night. But the mixer broke. Quote, "Everything breaks," I sobbed. "Nothing goes right. Everything goes wrong. Something's happened to us, John. We can't do things anymore. Not anything. I mean, how could you expect us to make a good baby when we can't even make a good cookie?" End quote. And I actually was laughing through this cookie baking debacle because I thought this is such an example of our overreaction to things and our tendency to say we're never good enough in anything that we do rather than looking in the moment. And, John, I believe, whipped up the cookies anyway without the mixer. But Martha's, reaction to it just made me think there are many times in my life where I overreact to things like that. And I just, throw the baby out with the bathwater and just nothing's going right.
Yeah, that was a pretty epic moment in the book. It was kind of this climax of Martha and John really being weighed down for quite a number of weeks now with the diagnosis of Adam while she's still pregnant, and yet they aren't talking about it very, very honestly. And this was it felt like the bubbling over of all of that internal just pressure. And it was a pivotal moment as well because they became so much closer through that event. I really thought that was an important reminder that there's a reward in opening up. And I am definitely the type of person that will eternally kind of internalize and analyze in my own head certain things, which, it's not very helpful most of the time, but also I'm very impacted by what I think people's expectations are, whereas opposed to if I just remember to open up and actually engage in dialogue and conversation with those people around me, I might realize that, the world isn't ending, but really, if I could just do A and B, then this person will be satisfied or I'll be more productive. And I tend to over-exaggerate things in my own head, that's for sure.
Oh, I definitely, and I don't think you're unique. I definitely know I do the exact same thing, and I'm pretty sure a lot of our listeners do, where you have this whole negative self-talk and you've worked yourself up to, in your own mind, telling yourself what other people think about you or your situation without ever actually communicating with them. And by the time that you've overworked your self-talk to this sort of pot boiling over point, you literally can't contain it anymore, and your anxiety and nerves take over. And that's, I think, exactly what sort of happened with Martha and the cookies. It was just all this stuff that she had worked up in her mind about people thinking about her or, the experiences that she was having, and she had no outlet for that energy. And I think it's really important for us to catch ourselves when we're engaging in that negative self-talk or, starting to wrap our minds around a topic a few too many times so that the rope is getting really tight. night, and realizing, we need to unwind. And whether that's by taking, a really warm bubble bath with candles and a glass of wine, or whether that's going to the gym or going on a hike, or, maybe you're a kayaker, or maybe you're a knitter, or, whatever it is that you do to relax. And it's remembering to take that time so that you can decompress, so that your pot isn't constantly boiling over. There was only one person at Harvard who came up to Martha and talked to her about her pregnancy. It was one of the other teaching fellows in the Caribbean Society class. Quote, "She called me a week after the diagnosis and told me that a relative of hers had committed suicide. Talking about actual problems is a wonderful way to move forward through shock and grief to acceptance, but talking about uncertainty can't lead anywhere but back to uncertainty, and it is a painful journey." End quote. I've experienced personally a lot of loss in my life. And, Martha talking about that no one would say anything to her. And in the book, she discusses a little bit how she felt like people were whispering behind her back, but never talking directly to her. And I think it's because people are really uncomfortable with the idea of loss and they just don't know what to say.
When I was going through miscarriages, I didn't talk about it. Actually, this is probably the first time publicly I've ever spoken about it. But and it was because it was painful, and I think that's why it's a taboo subject. But at the same time, there have been a few women in my life who have actually opened up to about this experience, and I didn't realize I was helping them because they were going through something similar. And so it's really important. Again, it's just a reminder to me and to everyone to, not be oversharing of things for the sake of, for any, I don't know, the best reasons you should share, to reach out and ask for help, and remember that that's okay. Even if it will make someone uncomfortable at some point, I think we have to do what's best for us as well. And it took me a long time to kind of realize that. And I don't know that I fully understand it yet, but I've definitely seen the impact it can have.
Yeah, and I think that, when I hear, after I've suffered a loss, like, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Like, it's nice, but it feels so cold and impersonable to me. And I think it's this sort of when my friends, instead of saying, "I'm so sorry for your loss," have said, "My heart and prayers are with you, and I'm thinking about you today," or "I said a prayer for you today," or, they send me a bottle of wine, or they send me, a card of sympathy. But it's sort of taking that next step and expressing that friendship in a way that I think is really important to the person in that moment. And, with Martha, having that woman come up to her and say, about the suicide attempt, well, I guess, the relative actually did commit suicide. It really made me also wonder, how many of us silently suffer? How many of us have experienced great loss in our lives and we just have no one to talk about it with because it's such an uncomfortable topic for people to hear about?
Well, and it seemed like Martha felt most comforted by the people who had experienced what she thought she was about to experience. She talks about it kind of being a tragedy, feeling like it's a tragedy at first, having knowledge of Adam's diagnosis. Obviously, she feels differently later, that it's a joyful and celebration. But I think that having people who have similar experiences, they can serve a very important purpose in that comfort. And if you don't have the experience that someone might have gone through, that's okay too. Like you said, just offering kind of an open line of communication, where saying simply, "I'm sorry for your loss," might feel very closed and singular in experience. I think checking up with people regularly, it's when a couple weeks pass and no one's saying those things anymore. That's the important time to say, "Hey, how are you doing? I know it's been a couple months since so-and-so passed," or whatever. I think that I've really appreciated those moments, and I've seen other people be very comforted by that continual awareness of how they might be feeling now.
I absolutely agree with that. Martha describes a time when Adam was young and sick. In the middle of the night, Adam woke her up, clearly sorry to have disturbed her. She got out of bed and went with Adam back to his room, where he had attempted to clean up his throw-up all by himself. He helped Martha clean up the room further and then fell back to sleep. Martha says, quote, "Adam's gentlemanly stoicism in the face of illness did not come from me. My method is to rage against the dying of the light, and I believe in getting started as soon as the light displaces the tiniest flicker." end quote. And her notion of rage against the dying of the light, it's a Dylan Thomas poem that's called Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. It's actually one of my favorite poems because it always reminds me to put forth the struggle and to ensure that, you keep fighting through your challenges in life. And just the way that Martha was describing Adam's fight and his constant desire to help her through his childhood was really a touching thing to read about.
She speaks a lot about how much she learned from Adam. And I think that was one of my favorite parts of the book, because again, it kind of goes back to being strong and being resilient and at times being the calm and collected person, but also the permission to be, full of sorrow and break down. And Martha showed us the full spectrum of all those emotions. And at the same time, you can take stoicism almost too far, I think, if it becomes like your only reaction, because I've definitely seen people who almost become callous in these really horrible situations to the point where it almost seems like they might not be expressing with anybody the pain or the negative emotions that they might be experiencing. Do you think that's possible? Someone can be too stoic?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. So I think it's really important that we express our emotion. Now, there's some people that are overly emotional all the time, but I think that there are those moments when it's the right thing to do. And if you're a stoic in the wrong moment, people actually will negatively react to that. For instance, if you're going through the grieving process and you're just stoic and I'm not going to have any emotion about this, it's really off-putting to your other family members or, to people that you're talking with, and people might even think you're a little weird. So yeah, I think like everything, there's a balance on, how far should you take the stoicism, or in Martha's case, how far should you rage and how far should you push? So I kind of thought about that. Throughout the book, Martha describes many moments where she felt as though she were being guided to make certain decisions, being supported and pushed ahead. She discusses angels not in a religious sense, but as in people who come into our lives when we need guidance the most. Quote, "For now it's enough for me to think that angels, or for that matter any form of goodness, function like water. They run into any opening they are given. There may be some people who are born open, who soak up goodness like sponges and leave traces of it on everything they touch. But even when an ordinary person like me, or a bad person like, say, Hitler, has a moment of openness, a moment of compassion, goodness rushes in to fill that space, to make us capable of receiving grace and transmitting it." End quote. And Martha talks throughout the book of these different angels that came into her life throughout the pregnancy and then in Adam's life. And, there was the man at the hardware store that showed her that Adam was, sniffing all the flowers, and what a beautiful moment that was. And there's Sibyl, who continued to support Martha through her pregnancy and then, took care of Katie when Martha and John went to the hospital for Adam's birth. And I think if we pause, we can all think about angels that we've encountered in our life.
My head directly went to some of the actually now passed away, but the older generation in my family of women, two in particular, my great aunt Helen, who lived in the same town as I did in undergraduate college in Rochester, New York. And, here I am embarking into the world for the first time on my own, 4 years at undergrad, and she lives in the same town, and she would have me over probably about once a month for Sunday dinner. And sometimes I go to church with her and everything, but she was a lovely woman. She had a great sense of humor, but that regular connection to someone outside of my generation and just kind of the wisdom that comes with it, it was a really special time. And I'm very thankful I had 4 years of that. And I definitely think of her as an angel.
Yeah, and I have the same sort of thing with my maternal grandmother, who has now passed away. She and I had this opportunity to become extremely close for about 4 or 5 years before she passed away. And I cherish those moments so deeply because she was such a strong and resilient woman. And the things that she went through in her life, I mean, she was a nurse in World War II. She raised 4 kids. She was a grandmother to 10. And she was this amazingly religious woman as well, and she just let God guide her life. And I always think about her when I'm in these, trying moments. And I think, what would grandma say? But she really gave me that background and that strength that I think that hopefully I'm still carrying with me today. We end today with the way that Martha ended the book, with a poem entitled The Layers by Stanley Kunitz. Part of the poem is as follows. I turn with my will intact to go wherever I need to go, and every stone on the road precious to me. No doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written. I am not done with my changes. End quote. Martha notes, quote, we are not done with our changes. There are too many Adams on earth to let that happen. There is an Adam in your life, count on it. He may have Down syndrome, your Adam, or he may not. She may be very small and inarticulate, or tall and eloquent. They may come as a group, speaking in odd voices filled with strange wisdom that threaten your shadow world. Watch for your Adams. Listen to them. Let them teach you to listen to yourself. Expect them. End quote. When I read this at the end of the book, I really felt like Martha's discussion of Adam throughout the book wanted me to open up my eyes a little bit more to people who maybe I don't see. They're there, but I'm just not seeing them.
I think that quote is something I kind of want to print out and put above my office and in my house. And, it's just a good reminder to keep, like you say, our eyes open and always be willing to to extend outward and not always be drawing inward. And, I feel like we all have times in our life, I feel like in college I was very self-absorbed and I probably took a lot more than I ever gave. And now as I've grown older, and have a family of my own, I actually, try to reach out to my other family members that don't live near us each week, or, I try to just do maybe one thing a day that is intentionally outward, and also try to be better at listening. And it's those simple things that we can learn so much. And I feel like when I get swept up in kind of the pace of life and I'm going 100 miles an hour and trying to get after it, with work and home and extracurricular things, it's so important each and every day to slow down and remember the most vibrant things of life.
And on that note, that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening and downloading and sharing this experience with Expecting Adam with us. You can also interact with us and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we announce episodes and share additional information about each podcast. If you have questions or comments about today's podcast, please submit them to us via our website at modernathenas.com, our Facebook page also under Modern Athenas, our Twitter account at Modern Athenas, or our Instagram account at the Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate if you support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to our podcast. In our next podcast, Podcast 7, we will have with us our first guest, Sarah Armstrong. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like each of the modern Athenas we discussed throughout our podcasts, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.